My name is Emily Carter, and I was 34 years old the afternoon my father handed my sister the keys to a house that was supposed to change both of our lives. Looking back now, from a distance of years and hard-won perspective, I think nearly everyone gathered in that attorney's conference room already believed they knew how the day would end. Everyone, that is, except me. I had driven to downtown that morning in the same reliable sedan I'd owned for 6 years. Sensible, paid off, practical. Sarah, my younger sister, arrived 20 minutes late in a car she'd leased just 3 months earlier. A gleaming thing that cost more per month than most people spend on groceries. Nobody commented on the contrast. Nobody ever did. That was simply how our family had always operated. An unspoken arrangement that had calcified over decades into something nobody questioned anymore. To understand what happened that afternoon in Mr. Reynolds' office, you have to first understand what the 30 years before it had looked like. You have to understand the particular quiet experience of growing up as the dependable one. My younger sister Sarah had always been the family's favorite. Not in an obvious, announced way. Not at first, anyway. My parents never said it out loud. They never sat me down and explained that Sarah was more beloved, more anticipated, more interesting. They didn't have to say a word. The message arrived in 1,000 smaller communications, so consistent and so pervasive that it eventually became its own kind of silence. When Sarah came home from school with A's and B's scattered across her report card, my parents praised her warmly. They called it hard work. They called it dedication. They made her feel that she had accomplished something worthy of celebration. When I came home with straight A's, every single semester, without exception, my mother would glance at the card, nod once, and set it on the kitchen counter like a piece of mail that didn't require an immediate response. It was expected. Therefore, it was unremarkable. The bar for me was set so high that clearing it produced nothing but the expectation that I would clear it again next time. The pattern continued through high school and into college, sharpening with every passing year into something I could no longer explain away or soften with generous interpretation. When Sarah switched college majors 3 separate times, first English literature, then marketing, then something she vaguely described as communications and design, my parents called her adventurous. They said she was finding herself, discovering her passions, refusing to be boxed in. When I spent weeks carefully researching career paths, chose financial consulting, mapped out a clear trajectory, and then systematically executed that plan over the following decade, earning promotions, building a client base, growing a reputation, they called me practical. They said it with a kind of affectionate neutrality, the way you might describe a well-organized filing cabinet. Sarah was exciting. I was dependable, and dependable, in our family's emotional economy, never received applause. By the time we were both fully grown adults, me in my early 30s, Sarah not far behind, the disparity had stopped being something I could politely ignore. Sarah had constructed a life built almost entirely around appearances. Expensive vacations photographed from their most glamorous angles, a new car every few years, always something stylish. An endless stream of social media posts that painted a picture of a woman living exactly the life she deserved. Or at least the life she wanted others to believe she was living. The financial reality behind those images was something nobody in the family examined too closely. When Sarah asked our parents for help with a down payment, they helped. When she needed assistance with an unexpected expense, they assisted. It was never discussed openly. It was simply quietly done, and then quietly filed away in the column of things our family didn't talk about. Meanwhile, I worked, I saved. I invested carefully and without drama. I paid my own bills from the beginning, even when I was young and money was genuinely tight. I built a life that didn't photograph particularly well, because most of it happened in ordinary rooms during ordinary hours, doing ordinary things that didn't lend themselves to captions or filters. I didn't expect praise for it. I didn't even particularly want praise. It was simply who I was and who I had always been. 3 years before my father died, his health began to slip. It started the way these things often do. Too gradually to name at first, too easy to rationalize. A forgotten appointment here, a phone call he couldn't recall making, small things that a busy person might simply attribute to distraction or fatigue. Then, as the months accumulated, larger things began to surface. Doctor visits that became regular, a hospital stay that lasted longer than anyone expected, physical therapy, medication management, paperwork that seemed to multiply like something alive. Sarah was, during this entire period, unavailable. Not cruelly, not with any particular malice, just consistently, reliably unavailable in the way that a person becomes when their own life has been arranged in a way that leaves no margin for inconvenience. She had work deadlines that couldn't be moved. She had weekend trips already planned. She had networking events, social obligations, reasons that were always technically legitimate and collectively amounted to an absence so complete it was almost architectural. Dad never complained. Not once. Not about Sarah. Not in my hearing. If he was disappointed, and he must have been, surely he must have been, he kept that disappointment somewhere private and never allowed it to surface. He deflected questions about her with the same quiet loyalty he'd always shown. "She's finding herself," he'd say, using the same phrase my parents had used when she switched majors. "She means well. Give her time." He said it with such genuine patience that I could never quite bring myself to point out that Sarah had been finding herself for the better part of 3 decades, and that finding oneself was perhaps not something that should take quite so long at the expense of the people who loved you. I gave her the time. I always gave her the time. And meanwhile, I drove Dad to his appointments. I sat with him in waiting rooms that smelled of antiseptic and quiet anxiety, filling out intake forms while he watched game shows on mounted televisions. I organized his medications into those small plastic containers with the days of the week printed on their lids. I handled his paperwork, insurance claims, billing disputes, the particular maddening bureaucracy of aging. I fixed things around the house. The gutter that had been pulling away from the roofline, the back door that wouldn't latch properly, the bathroom faucet that had been dripping for months. And every Sunday, without exception, I brought lunch and spent the afternoon with him. I want to be honest about something here, because this story deserves honesty. I did not do these things because I was calculating a future reward. I did them because he was my father, and my father needed help, and helping him was the obvious thing to do. I would have done exactly the same things if I had known with absolute certainty that his entire estate was going to someone else. That is not virtue on my part. It is simply what love looks like when it's functioning the way it's supposed to. But I won't pretend it didn't hurt when Dad continued to defend Sarah. There were evenings when I drove home from his house feeling a loneliness that had no clean edges. The feeling of being the person who shows up and is somehow still never quite seen. 8 months before he passed, Dad called both of us to the family beach house. The same house his own parents had purchased decades earlier, the house that held the accumulated memory of our entire childhoods. Summer cookouts where the charcoal smell drifted across the yard. Christmas mornings when the radiators ticked and the windows fogged and the tree in the corner held ornaments we'd made in elementary school. Birthday parties, arguments, reconciliations, the 10,000 ordinary moments that over time become the architecture of a life shared. The house wasn't just property. It was a kind of proof that our family had existed. That afternoon, Dad stood out on the deck overlooking the water. The wind was strong enough to rattle the old wooden railings and push his silver hair sideways. He looked out at the water for a while without speaking, and then he said quietly, almost to himself as much as to us, "I want you girls to remember something." Sarah was glancing at her phone. I was watching him. "Money comes and goes," he said. There was a pause long enough to hold something. Character is what remains. At the time, I didn't reach for any particular meaning in the words. It seemed like something a father says when he is aware of his own mortality and wants to leave his children with something useful. "I was proud of you." 3 words. I had waited 34 years for those 3 words in that particular combination. "I may not have said it often enough," he continued, his voice carrying a slight roughness that I recognized as the sound of someone keeping their composure through effort. "I should have. I had many opportunities and I let them pass. And I am sorry for that. But I want you to know that I never, not once, stopped being proud of you. Not for a single day." He smiled then. The particular smile I had grown up with. The one that lived mostly in the corners of his eyes. "The trust isn't a reward. It's a responsibility, just like everything else. Use it carefully. Build something that matters. Support the things you believe in. And never, please Emily, never let money become more important than people. You already know that. You've always known that. I just wanted to say it out loud." He looked at the camera for another moment, and then the recording ended. Nobody moved for a long time after the screen went dark. Mr. Reynolds quietly closed the folder. He made a few final comments about timelines and transfer procedures, but I only half heard them. I was still somewhere inside what I had just witnessed. The strangeness of being seen, fully and without apology, after so many years of having quietly accepted that I wouldn't be. Sarah sat across the table with the house keys in her hand. She was looking at them differently than she had been an hour earlier. The keys themselves hadn't changed, but the story attached to them had changed completely, and she was working through what that meant. As people began to gather their things and the room started to reassemble itself into ordinary motion, nobody quite knew what to say to Sarah. Nobody quite knew what to say to me either, though a few relatives found their way over to squeeze my arm or say something quiet and sincere. One of my aunts held me for a long time without saying anything at all. That was the right instinct. Sarah and I did not speak that day. We stood in the elevator together without looking at each other. And then we walked out of the building in different directions into the ordinary afternoon light. In the months that followed, Sarah's circumstances changed considerably. The beach house, the house she had spent years imagining as the centerpiece of her inheritance, the emblem of our father's preference for her, turned out to be exactly what Dad's letter said it was. She sold several personal assets to begin addressing the repair obligations. She negotiated with county offices. She learned things about seawall construction and flood compliance that she had never expected to know. The process was humbling in the specific, productive way that real challenges are humbling. It stripped away some of the easy confidence and left something more solid in its place. In the conversations I eventually had with her, months after the estate meeting, I noticed that she had stopped talking about what she deserved. She talked instead about what things cost, what things required, what it meant to actually be responsible for something that needed you. As for me, I did what Dad asked. I engaged the Trust's existing management team and began to understand what I had inherited. I expanded some investments carefully and conserved others. I funded the scholarship at our high school and expanded it. I supported the environmental organization he'd donated to. I built, slowly and without particular drama, a version of the future he had spent 12 years quietly preparing for me. Sometimes when I'm sitting somewhere ordinary, at my desk in the morning, or driving somewhere in my sensible paid-off car, I think about that afternoon in the conference room. The keys spinning around Sarah's finger. The sealed envelope nobody had mentioned. The moment when Mr. Reynolds said my name and the room changed. My father spent 12 years preparing something for me in silence. He watched, and noticed, and recorded, and planned, and never once let any of it change the texture of an ordinary Sunday afternoon. He never made me feel that the lunches were being filed away somewhere, that the appointments were being noted in a ledger, that the years of showing up had a value I would eventually collect. He just let it be what it was. That might be the most extraordinary thing about all of it. Everyone in that conference room had assumed the day was about inheritance. About assets. About who Dad had loved more. The truth was quieter and more permanent than that. He hadn't been measuring love. He had been recognizing character. And character, he had told us on a windy deck 8 months before he died, is what remains. A seawall that had been deteriorating for years and required full replacement. A roof that had passed its functional lifespan and needed replacement before the next major storm season. Flood protection upgrades required by updated regional codes. And a long-standing environmental compliance agreement attached to the deed, signed by our grandparents as part of the original purchase. Conditions that required ongoing coastal restoration contributions and imposed significant restrictions on any sale or development of the property. "This has to be wrong," Sarah said. Her voice had lost its earlier ease entirely. "It is not wrong," Mr. Reynolds replied. Sarah picked up the top document and began flipping through it. The color continued to drain from her face as she read. One aunt actually covered her mouth with her hand. The projected costs to bring the property into compliance and complete the required repairs exceeded several $100,000. The timeline was not optional. The county requirements had legal teeth. "I want Sarah to understand," Mr. Reynolds continued reading, "that I am not punishing her. I am trusting her with something real. The beach house is where our family learned to be a family. It deserves stewardship, not just ownership. I hope in time she will understand the difference." Sarah set the documents down. "Then, what does the rest of the letter say?" Mr. Reynolds turned the page. "And now to the matter I have spent the last 12 years arranging quietly." The room, which had already been very still, somehow became more still. The kind of stillness that happens when a large group of people simultaneously stops breathing. 12 years ago, I established a separate family trust. It has remained confidential by design, protected from pressure, from expectations, and from entitlement. Over the years, I have added to it gradually and carefully, through investment decisions, property acquisitions, and business arrangements that I conducted privately. What trust? Sarah demanded. The word came out sharply, almost involuntarily. Mr. Reynolds ignored the interruption. The trust was designed with a specific beneficiary in mind, not the child who made the most noise, not the child who asked the most questions about money, the child who demonstrated, over years and years of ordinary days, that she understood what it means to be responsible for another person. He set the letter down, reached into his briefcase, and removed a second folder. This one was substantially thicker than the folder containing the house documents. He set it on the table in front of him. Then he looked directly at me. "Emily," he said, and something in his voice shifted, a note of careful, long-held restraint being released. "Your father spent over a decade preparing these arrangements." I looked at the folder. I looked at Mr. Reynolds. I looked back at the folder. Sarah was staring at it with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger exactly, but something closer to fear. The kind of fear that arrives when you realize that the thing you were certain you understood has turned out to be something else entirely. Mr. Reynolds opened the folder. "Under the terms of the Carter Family Trust," he said, his voice now carrying the formal weight of legal precision, "all protected assets are transferred, in their entirety, to Emily Carter." For a moment, I wasn't sure I had heard the words correctly. I sat very still and let them settle. Sarah had gone white. "What assets?" she said. The sharpness was gone from her voice. What replaced it was something quieter and more fundamental. The attorney began sliding documents across the table toward me, page by page, with the methodical patience of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times in his mind. The first page showed an investment portfolio, diversified, professionally managed, with a decade plus of growth that had compounded in the quiet way that careful long-term investing compounds when nobody interferes with it. The second page showed ownership interests in 3 commercial properties. The third detailed a set of dividend-producing business partnerships. Page after page followed. I turned them carefully, reading each one, not entirely trusting what I was seeing. Dad had been doing this for 12 years. Quietly, patiently, without telling anyone, without hinting at it, without ever once altering the texture of an ordinary Sunday afternoon. The total value appeared at the bottom of the final summary page. I read it once. I read it again. I read it a third time. It didn't change. The trust was worth substantially more than the beach house. Not marginally more. Significantly, dramatically more. The room erupted. Not in noise, but in the kinetic equivalent of noise. The rustling and gasping and shifting that people produce when their understanding of a situation is revised all at once. One of my aunts said, "Oh my God," out loud, quietly, to nobody in particular. Someone else made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Sarah looked back and forth between the documents and Mr. Reynolds with the expression of someone whose internal model of reality is failing to accommodate new information. "There has to be a mistake," she said. "There is no mistake. The house was supposed to be the main inheritance." "According to your father's instructions," Mr. Reynolds said, with the calm of someone who anticipated this objection and prepared for it, "the trust was always the primary inheritance. The beach house was one component of a much larger plan." Sarah looked down at the brass keys on the table in front of her. She picked them up, then set them back down. Somewhere in the last 45 minutes, they had stopped looking like a prize and started looking like exactly what Dad had said they were. "There is one final item," Mr. Reynolds said. The room went quieter still. The attorney reached for a small device on the table, pressed a button, and a screen at the end of the conference room came to life. For a moment the image was dark, and then it resolved into a face I knew better than almost any other face in the world. There was my father. He was sitting in his study, surrounded by the bookshelves he'd been adding to since before I was born. He looked older than the last version of him I carried in my memory. Thinner, with lines around his eyes that were more pronounced. But his eyes themselves were unchanged, calm, direct, certain. He had recorded this months before he died. While still here, while there was still time, while he still had the ability to choose. And that fact made everything that followed feel more significant than anything written on any of the papers stacked across that table. "If you're watching this," he said into the camera, into whatever room we would eventually be watching from, "then Mr. Reynolds has explained the trust." Nobody in the conference room made a sound. "I know some people may be surprised by my decisions." He paused. "Especially Sarah." Across the table, Sarah lowered her eyes. "When people think about inheritance," Dad continued, "they usually focus on what they're going to receive. How much, what it means for their future, what they can do with it." He shook his head slowly. "That's the wrong way to think about it. That's always been the wrong way to think about it." He looked into the camera with the directness of someone who had stopped worrying about being misunderstood. "I wasn't looking for the smartest child. I wasn't looking for the most successful child, or the most impressive one, or the one who made other people admire me at family dinners. I was looking for the child who showed up." His voice softened on those last two words. "The one who came when nobody was watching. The one who helped without calculating what the help might eventually be worth. The one who treated responsibility as a privilege rather than a burden." Several relatives around the table were crying, quietly, in the way people cry when something true is being said out loud, and they recognize it in their own lives. "Character doesn't reveal itself during the good times," he continued. "It doesn't show itself during celebrations, or family photographs, or the moments when life is easy and everything is going well. Character appears in the ordinary moments, the inconvenient ones, the ones nobody photographs." He paused. "It appears when someone has every reason not to show up and shows up anyway." I had stopped trying to keep my face composed. Tears were moving down my face and I let them. Then he looked directly into the camera in a way that, despite the screen and the conference room and the 15 other people present, felt entirely private. "Emily," he said, "if you're seeing this, there's something I want you to know." I felt the room disappear around me the way rooms sometimes do when you hear your own name spoken with a particular weight. A piece of wisdom, the kind that sounds true in a general way without demanding anything specific. Months later, standing in a downtown conference room with tears running down my face, those words would mean everything. Dad passed away peacefully the following spring, on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the light was coming through his bedroom window at a low gold angle. The funeral was difficult in the particular way that funerals are difficult when you loved someone imperfectly and were loved imperfectly in return. The grief mixed up with everything unresolved, every conversation that didn't happen, every moment of connection that came close, and then didn't quite arrive. For several weeks afterward, time moved strangely. I went through the motions of my normal life with the feeling that everything had been slightly shifted on its axis. Then came the estate meeting. The attorney's office occupied the top floor of a glass building downtown. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, the kind of view designed to remind you that things of importance happen in rooms like this. A long table ran down the center of it. By the time I arrived, the room was already filling with relatives, aunts, uncles, 2 cousins, who had gathered with the barely concealed alertness of people who know that something significant is about to be distributed and want to witness it. Sarah arrived wearing a designer outfit I didn't recognize. She carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who has already decided how something is going to end. She set her bag down at the chair nearest the head of the table, ordered coffee from the assistant who appeared at the door, and made easy small talk with relatives while I found a seat at the far end and sat quietly. The attorney, Mr. Reynolds, was a composed man with wire-rimmed glasses and the practiced calm of someone who has delivered important news to families for many years. He greeted everyone, waited for the room to settle, and opened a thick folder on the table in front of him. "Thank you all for being here," he said. "I'll begin with the formal reading of the will." He started with the charitable donations, a local environmental organization Dad had supported for years, a scholarship fund he'd quietly contributed to at our high school. Then several personal gifts to longtime friends and a few members of the extended family. Then, as Mr. Reynolds moved through the pages and the remaining assets grew larger and the room grew tenser, I noticed Sarah beginning to sit slightly straighter in her chair. She was leaning forward almost imperceptibly, the way a person leans when they're listening for something specific. "The family beach house," Mr. Reynolds said, adjusting his glasses. shall transfer in full ownership to Sarah Carter. The room absorbed this in a single breath. Sarah's lips curved before he had finished the sentence. Not a smile of happiness exactly. Not the kind of smile that comes from surprise or gratitude. It was the smile of someone who has been waiting to be proven right. She received the brass house keys that Mr. Reynolds placed on the table, and, I am not embellishing this, she actually spun them once around her finger. A small, deliberate performance for the audience present. Then she looked directly at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. A few looked toward me with expressions of sympathy, carefully calibrated not to be too obvious. Everyone in the room seemed to have agreed silently that the day's proceedings were essentially over. Mr. Reynolds continued reading. A few smaller distributions. Sarah sat back in her chair with the air of someone watching the credits roll on a film they've already decided they loved. She held the keys loosely in one hand, turning them slightly. But Mr. Reynolds wasn't finished. I noticed it before most of the others did. He had set aside the final page of the will, but he hadn't closed the folder. More importantly, there was a sealed envelope resting beside it, cream-colored, slightly thick, with handwriting on the front that I recognized before I could even read it. It had been sitting there the entire time, and nobody had mentioned it once. Sarah was beginning to stand, the way people do when a meeting is clearly wrapping up. "Well," she said, with the satisfaction she wasn't troubling herself to conceal, holding the keys up slightly. "I think Dad made his wishes pretty clear." A few relatives nodded, the awkward nods of people trying to be agreeable without fully committing to anything. Then Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat. It was a small sound, a minor professional punctuation, but something in the quality of it stopped the room completely. "Actually," he said. Sarah slowly lowered back into her chair. The attorney reached for the sealed envelope. His expression, which had been professionally neutral throughout, shifted into something more careful, more deliberate, as if he had been waiting for this moment and was treating it with appropriate weight. "This," he said, holding the envelope up so the room could see it, "contains your father's final instruction." Nobody spoke. The air conditioning hummed faintly somewhere in the walls. Mr. Reynolds opened the envelope with a small silver letter opener and removed several pages of handwritten paper. Dad's handwriting. I knew it immediately. The slightly tilted letters, the way he always pressed too hard with the pen so that the words were almost embossed on the page. My throat tightened before he had read a single word. The attorney adjusted his glasses, looked at the room for a moment, and began. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and Sarah has already received the beach house." Sarah, across the table, smiled again. Just briefly, for approximately 3 seconds. "Before anyone celebrates or feels disappointed, there are things you deserve to know." The smile faded. For many years, I watched both of my daughters make choices. Some choices were loud, some were quiet. Some impressed people at family dinners. Others went completely unnoticed. I paid attention to all of them. The room had gone so still I could hear someone breathing. Sarah always loved being seen. Emily never cared who was watching. Sarah shifted in her chair. She set the keys down on the table. When my health began to fail, I learned something important that I wish I had understood much earlier. The people who claim to love you, and the people who show that they love you, are not always the same people. I looked down at the table in front of me. My eyes were stinging. Emily drove me to every appointment. Emily organized my medications. Emily handled my paperwork and fought with my insurance company and fixed things around the house that I could no longer fix myself. Emily sat with me on evenings when I couldn't sleep and didn't feel like being alone. Emily brought lunch every single Sunday and stayed the entire afternoon, not because I asked her to, but because she decided it mattered. My eyes were stinging badly now. I had not expected this. After years of feeling functionally invisible in my own family, I had simply stopped expecting to be seen. And here was my father, from beyond any ability to reach him, doing exactly that. Sarah visited when it was convenient. Emily showed up when it was necessary. Across the table, Sarah was sitting very still. The casual confidence, the slightly triumphant ease, it was gone. She was looking at the letter with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. I couldn't immediately name it. For 3 years, I listened carefully to what both of my daughters asked about and what they didn't ask about. I noticed who asked how I was feeling and who asked what would happen to the house, A few relatives exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances. Several people in this room may not know this, but Sarah, on multiple occasions over the past several years, encouraged me to transfer significant assets into her name early. She suggested at various times selling the beach property, restructuring investments, and reconsidering arrangements that had been in place for years. Sarah's face had turned a color I can only describe as deeply, mortifyingly red. Dad never said, "That's not," she started. Mr. Reynolds raised one hand calmly, in a way that didn't invite argument. "The letter will be read in full." Sarah fell silent. Sometimes she asked what the inheritance might look like. Sometimes she talked about future plans built around money she had not yet earned, and that was not yet hers. I found these conversations difficult. I did not have them with Emily, not once, not in 30 years. The room felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago. "The beach house," Mr. Reynolds continued, turning the page, "was never intended to be a reward." Sarah blinked. "What?" she said almost to herself. "It was a responsibility." The attorney reached into a separate folder and removed a stack of documents, several inches thick, dense with text and official formatting. He slid them across the table toward Sarah. "The property carries significant obligations that have been deferred for several years due to my illness, and that will now require immediate attention." But then one by one, Mr. Reynolds read through the list. Property taxes in substantial arrears, a structural assessment requirement mandated by the coastal county within the next 18 months,